Hi, my name is Melanie Dante, and the Reverend Beverly Dale has asked for me to help explain to you why sex workers oppose rescue. I'm going to add the header that we're talking about sex workers in the sense of consensual adults involved in a commercial transaction involving intimacy or sexuality as a form of recreation or therapy. We're not talking about people being held hostage, chained in basements, drugged, and being forced to have sex with dozens of people per day. We're talking about why sex workers oppose rescue. I think to open that up, I'm going to clarify that rescue is part of something called LEAD. LEAD is Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion is a program that was started by George Soros and has spread across the nation in ways that help for task force agencies and social services to be funded by saving prostitutes from pimps and predators in the name of rescuing them from human trafficking. Sex workers strive to create better working conditions for themselves. Most women who are consensual sex workers do it because they are okay with the concept of doing it, but they also do it for the money. The money is helpful for them to be able to pay their bills and to do things that they would not be able to do otherwise. Usually, sex workers are okay with the work that they do, but not always okay with the conditions in which they are doing their work. Some sex workers are activists to try to create better conditions. Most of those sex workers support something called decriminalization. Sex workers support decriminalization over legalization so that they can have more autonomy and independence in the way that they do their work. That said, let's go back to law enforcement assisted diversion, which is a form of rescue. I'd like to read to you now an article that was printed in Tits and Sass, written by Lindsay Roth. Lindsay Roth was the director of SWAP USA and also of Project Safe in Philadelphia. Lindsay and I worked together with SWAP Philly, Project Safe, and also on global network of sex work projects efforts. Lindsay has written an article called Diversion Programs Are for Cops that was published on February 8th in or on Tits and Sass, a website that talks about issues in the sex industry. I think her article is extremely intelligent and will help for you to understand why sex workers are opposed to diversion and rescue. There is significant debate within our sex worker community about whether LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Programming, a pre-booking diversion program for low-level drug and sex work-related offensive, is a good or a bad thing. The first LEAD program launched in Seattle, Washington in 2011 with private funding from the Ford Foundation, the Open Society Foundation's Vital Projects Funds, and several others. This pilot program has been championed by law enforcement and drug reform advocates alike and has since launched into several other cities with slight regional variations. Just this Monday, the Baltimore Sun ran a story about the launch of a three-year pilot LEAD program in a city which Police Commissioner Kevin Davis framed as a response to Baltimore's proposed police reform agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice. A recent evaluation of LEAD programs conducted by researchers at the University of Washington yields seemingly impressive outcomes for the communities they allegedly serve. Indeed, LEAD programming even names sex workers and drug users as their consumers, a rather misleading label for those in state custody, implying agency where there is none. In truth, LEAD programming does not serve sex workers or drug users or those profiled as such. Rather, LEAD can be understood as a diversionary program for law enforcement officers and should be analyzed under this lens. Diversionary programs like LEAD represent the co-optation of harm reduction lingo in the service of criminalization, masquerading as social services. While we may rejoice at terms like sex worker and people who use drugs being used by institutions who typically use other nastier language to describe these populations, the population they are actually talking about is people living in poverty. Programs like LEAD, which claim to provide case management, public housing, and job training, don't target drug users and sex workers, as most people who do drugs and trade sex have those needs met. Many, if not most, sex workers and drug users have had the social and economic capital to get high or make money in private homes, apartments, or rented rooms in areas that are not under constant police surveillance. So why do poor people, many of whom lack economic capital because of deliberate targeted U.S. policies, need a diversionary program? They don't. Cops do. Many sex workers meaning Lindsay, who wrote this article, have spoken with about LEAD, think it's a good way to get those who are desperately needing housing or medication or other necessities, things which traditionally fall under the category of fundamental human rights. But we must consider what is gained and what is lost when private funders like Open Society Foundation and other progressive grant makers support programs in which individuals achieve access to fundamental human rights as consequences of crimes they may or may not have committed. LEAD reinforces the logic that people who are trading sex or using drugs need intervention. Let's stop there for a moment. That's really the thing. Rescue is about intervening into the lives of people who have not stated clearly and specifically that they need help. Let's go back to the article now. LEAD reinforces the logic that people who are trading sex or using drugs need intervention from law enforcement, even if that intervention is a softer redirect towards social services. Do we? Increasingly, the answer, as supported by research, is a resounding no. As prohibitive policies against drug use and sex work are repealed and replaced, law enforcement workers are looking for new ways to stay relevant in the lives of those they have hunted, abused, and marginalized for the past few decades. The LEAD National Support Bureau, made up mainly of law enforcement, publicly acknowledges an urgent crisis of mass criminalization and incarceration, and yet advocates for, well, more police. The logic of LEAD is not much different from that of community policing, which made strategies like stop and frisk and broken windows household names and redirected billions of taxpayer dollars to the Justice Department and away from education, infrastructure, and health care. Advocates of these policies fail to realize that the issues that they want to address, like drug use, are hardly a matter of police and community relationships. Rather, the root of these issues lies in the systemic disenfranchisement of the targeted communities. The metrics used to evaluate LEAD speak to the values of its advocates, who include law enforcement and professional helpers who are willing to collude with them. Recidivism rates and public spending tend to be popular measures of the program's successes for advocates to point to. Evaluation data demonstrates that LEAD programs do reduce recidivism for those charged with low-level misdemeanors, which saves everyone money because our massive prison industrial complex is expensive. But there was no data on the quality of life for the consumers in the recent evaluation, because their welfare is measured in how they affect the rest of the population, not according to their own articulated needs and objectives. I, or Lindsay, who has written this article, have no doubt LEAD works by its defined metrics, but the creators and the founders of LEAD need to understand that they are not replacing McGruff, the crime dog's accusatory finger, with a bear hug. There are law enforcement officers who work in districts now offering LEAD who have been allowed to do significant harm to people simply because they are accused of doing drugs or sex work, both judicially or extrajudicially. Vague quality of life regulations like loitering enable police to profile individuals, especially women of color, as sex workers. The legacy of police violence against sex workers is well researched and well documented, as many police abuse their power to demand sexual service or money. Lead programming does not right these wrongs. In fact, diversion programming often and simply further burdens consumers with open criminal records and time-consuming mandatory classes. Still, Lindsay truly believes that most lead advocates want the best for sex workers and people who use drugs as much as they can imagine them as people who deserve these things in non-coercive settings. She's not sure that they can, and you know what? I'm not sure they can either. And that's really the problem with rescue. When people are rescued for their own good from the lives that they are living, but they're not given all of the tools to truly empower them to go forward, it is a form of conversion therapy or behavior modification. This is part of the problem with rescue. I myself have even appealed in a time of crisis to one of Pennsylvania's leading anti-trafficking advocates, a person in a punitive position of power who, when I found out that my stepfather was arrested for child pornography and I was going to lose my home, actually took my personal information for 5 months, stating that they were going to help for me to research the statute of limitations to be able to have some legal footing to navigate the situation, and instead sent me a letter telling me that my entire life narrative was now going to be part of their institutional research at my exclusion. I would be able to access this research when it would be made public, and that it was suggested that I find an attorney. I was not offered any services, any counsel, any assistance, and I was told specifically that I was never offered any of that. So I don't know what happens when people are, say, rescued from a brothel that's going through a police raid, but I can say from both my own personal experience, my academic understanding of things, my professional associations, and the editorials and the academic essays that they are writing on the topic, that on the whole, people only embrace rescue positively when they are forced to, and they don't have any other alternatives, and so therefore they have to be compliant and subordinate to those programs. What would be better? Well, if people are not getting in trouble for the lives that they're living, then why should there be any intervention? If there are problems and people would like to list what their problems are, figuring out community solutions to those problems might be more effective than having police and behavioral health specialists intervene in people's lives when their lives are basically unfolding and evolving, and not necessarily needing to be defined as a criminal process, but as a personal growth issue. I will also conclude that many sex workers are afraid of interacting with faith-based professionals, even those who mean them well, because most know that as a result of PEPFAR, the Anti-Prostitution Loyalty Clause, and the Conscientious Clause, we are not welcomed into discussions if we acknowledge being either prostitutes, sex workers, even those looking to exit, or in any way supportive of those who are. That might be a good following conversation. I thank you all for your time today. I hope that I was able to answer some of your questions. If you do have more questions, please email me. I will either do an email response or a video response to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen.